welcome everybody. Thanks for coming along. My name is Fergus McNeill. I'm coming to you from sunny Glasgow, and it actually is today, but not in this building. It's freezing. So welcome. I'm co-chairing today with Marguerite. Do you want to say hello, Marguerite?
Okay, hi everybody. Nice to be here. Looking forward to what we're going to hear.
Great. So we're both based in the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research at Glasgow University, but our guests today are, as you can see, Thea Fredriksson and Robin Gålnander, both of whom work in Stockholm University's Department of Criminology. Thea's work focuses on prisons and desistance, and she uses intersectional and ontological frameworks, more of which to come, I'm sure, in explorations of spaces and processes of punishment. And Robin's work focuses on desistance from crime, but using feminist theories and methodologies. And he has conducted a longitudinal qualitative research project on women's desistance from crime since 2015. And that's the empirical basis for the book that we're going to be discussing today. So I think without further ado, I'll pass on to Thea and Robin, except to say they're going to talk for about 25 minutes. Then we're going to have swift responses from Marguerite and myself. And then hopefully for the last 20 minutes or so, we'll open it up to the floor and let you in with your questions, which you can either submit in the chat function or just raise a hand when we get to that point. But maybe if we put our microphones on mute for now and let Thea and Robin tell us about their book.
Wonderful. Thank you for that.
Yeah, it's very exciting to be here. We're just going over like, right, we wrote a book. What did we even write? What should we tell them? So it's fun to see how it's gonna land with all of you. So I guess we just share our slides and get with it.
Yeah, hopefully you'll be able to see it. The notes we will talk from about this book, Desistance, Resistance, and Normalcy. A couple of months it's been out now.
Yeah.
And we want to just, contextualize maybe a bit of the findings and make some kind of a foundation for the discussion that we want to have with you today.
Yeah.
So first, I'm just gonna go over, like Fergus said, the empirical bits of research that is behind this book. It is what I have termed the Maintaining Desistance study. That was my PhD study. Since 2015, I've conducted a longitudinal study of women's desistance from crime. The women are set in Sweden, different parts of Sweden, and I follow them with repeated prospective interviews. Initially, I conducted repeated interviews every 6 months for 2 years as part of the PhD project, and then I wrote the dissertation and I wrote some other publications, and then I received more funding to conduct yet another additional follow-up interview sweep in 2021, which were then 3 years after I had last seen them. We had been in contact during that time, but I hadn't seen them during those 3 years. So that was the interviews that I did for that project. And just to mention something about the women then, the age span is quite broad. The youngest one was 23 when I first met her, and the oldest were 53. And of course, they have aged. It's not only me who've been aging, but them too. They had all lived decades in criminalized lifestyles, segregated or excluded from mainstream society, which is the topic of this book, which we will come back to soon. But they had all been involved in what we term common street crime. It was a lot of drug offenses, thefts, robberies, assaults, that sort of thing. They had been involved in that for decades. That includes the youngest one, 23, so she started off quite young. And they all had a history of convictions. Some had more than 10 years of time served inside. And of course, also experiences with various different institutions in Sweden. We lock people up for drug misuse as well. So they had experiences with that as well. Right. Just a brief note on the methodological design, or primarily the timing of the interviews, just in case somebody wants to or are planning to conduct something similar. I found that the 6 monthly basis was fruitful. It was a good interval, perhaps because it was short enough for both me and them to remember the last time and what we talked about then, but also long enough for us both to present new things to talk about. They had, of course, new experiences. I had read stuff in between or talked to the other women, so I could come up with just some new topics to talk about. And it was good, and of course, great for creating report, which is paramount to this type of research. These women had been through a lot, and they didn't trust men, and they didn't trust authorities. And here I am, a man from a renowned university in Sweden. So that was, of course, key to this project as a whole. And I think it worked because they all agreed to meet me for the postdoc follow-up interviews. That was 3 years after we had said goodbye. I had said thank you. They never owed me anything, but they definitely didn't owe me anything after that PhD study was over. But still, they agreed to meet me again, which I think speaks volumes to how the report was quite solid. Right, I think that's it about that, right? So what this project has been able to capture then in a way is perhaps what life is like in desistance, in this liminal space between when they want to discard the old life and approach something new. And Maya captured this. Of course, these are all pseudonyms, but Maya, as I call her, or we call her, captured this in a brief quote. This was some years into her desistance journey, and she said, "So much is new, and it's lonely. It is lonely. I lead a very lonesome life. I don't know where to turn after 30 years of drug abuse, and I have nothing to do with that crowd anymore. Perhaps I'm not meant to fit in this society."
And I think this quote captures quite a lot of what we've been kind of finding is the space where the theoretical frameworks you've been working with and the ones I've been working with kind of have a lot of synergies, because what's happening here has so much to do with what's uncertain, what's unknown and unfamiliar. So that's the approach we've taken into desistance theory generally, like where do questions of uncertainty and when and how do these processes actualize questions of moving from something that you're familiar with into something that you're unfamiliar with. And at the same time, you kind of make the things that you used to know unfamiliar because you're supposed to change your life around. But then you got to familiarize yourself with these new things. So it's a very complicated and messy space to be. So you got to leave the life you know because it's wrong, but at least you know it, in pursuit of something very unfamiliar but normal that you're supposed to get acquainted with. So this actualizes a lot of questions of the futures that get lost along the way and the pasts that you leave behind but might be a bit sticky and tricky to leave in the past. So this at first led to an article we worked on when we were still both doing our respective PhDs and kind of realized that, hey, wait, there's a lot of what you're doing and what I'm doing that speaks to each other. But then, of course, you can never fit everything you want to say into one article. So that kind of spiraled into the book that we're here to talk about today. And building more off of Maya's quote, her ending question with "perhaps I'm not meant to fit in this society" sparked the question of what society are we actually talking about, and how does it look more from the outside? What does normalcy look like to somebody who did not grow up inside of it and therefore kind of become blind to how weird normalcy can look when you're kind of just used to it, so you take it for granted as normal? So what critical perspectives arise when we look at normalcy as something rather than the kind of taken for granted nothing of normalcy? And that very quickly showed several instances where just because something is normal, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's reasonable, especially for people kind of approaching it from a vulnerable position from the margins. And throughout all of this, like both the article and the book, it became quite apparent that we were writing from synergetic but different points of view. Because, I mean, you're very inside of these stories, like very inside of these interviews, very inside of like desistance literature, very much in the center of everything. Whereas I've been in my own kind of periphery with bringing like different kinds of theoretical perspectives, but also not having lived these interviews the way that you have. So to me, these were kind of stories. To me, these were words on a page rather than remembered conversations. So I think that did something different with how we approached the data.
Yeah, and like you said, this emerged as a perhaps fruitful ground for collaborations already when we were PhD students, because as you said, with your theoretical framework that you were working with at the time, the ontological aspects, I was definitely inspired by that and approached you because I could see it in my data as well. Because, of course, life course criminology, you always bring your history into the future where you want to go, and you're haunted by previous acts that you regret now and all of that. But definitely needed your help to pin those down conceptually. And yeah, that's, I guess, the third point here: context and concept.
Yeah, I guess the context versus concept notion is kind of, to make it very concrete, writing both of these pieces has been an interplay between you being extremely in tune with the context around everything and the details surrounding everything. Whereas I've seen started with like skimming through, seeing one excerpt and going, oh, is this maybe a story about insert concept here? And then the interplay of digging for more types of things that maybe support or nuance or take that concept in a different direction. But I've kind of been always coming at it from a conceptual point of view, and then the details are where we get to.
Yeah, and that ties into the second point here of memory and story as well, because you could just dream up a thing, right? You're like, oh, I would like to make this point. Can we make this point? I was like, yep.
Look here.
she talks about this, yeah.
But then also when you come to me with a random quote and going, isn't this kind of eerie or kind of creepy or kind of something, and that it feeds into a concept. So it's been a very fun type of back and forth between like tackling things kind of from the ground up or from a very broad perspective and down into the details.
And also living together, we have written this book.
Makes it very easy.
Yeah, like it is, like we sit now side by side. So all of this is very much
So it's kind of cheating to like co-write and cohabitate at the same time. Makes it very simple. But enough about that. Going into kind of the empirical themes of these respective chapters in the book, we kind of started off in the death theme because life in Desistance was very clearly marked by deaths in Desistance, which made for a pretty bleak opener, but nonetheless it kind of sets the scene for what's at stake here. So for turning to Maya again, the opening quote for this chapter is that I've had 6 boyfriends and 4 of them are dead. And that kind of encompasses a lot of what's at stake here. Because what we found throughout all of these different stories was how death shapes these desistance journeys and remained a very prevalent feature in these women's lives. And that was kind of surprising to them because they were attempting to leave their criminal pasts behind. And that's kind of where they saw these deaths fitting in. It wasn't overly surprising that violent or drug-related deaths happened in these criminalized lifestyles. But moving into quote unquote normalcy, those kinds of encounters were supposed to be something that was part of what you leave behind. But it continued to shape these journeys in ways that they were not really prepared to face. These deaths very often centered male partners, but also like the male partners of friends, and they kind of disrupted these hopes for a new normal life because these painful things still kept happening, and that highlighted a continuity between the past they wanted to get away from and the present and even future that they were heading towards. And while some of the women could respond to these tragedies by kind of falling back into old habits and viewing it as some more or less of a fuck it moment, which has to be my favorite academic term of all time, others tended to view this as kind of a, if I don't change lanes, I'm going to be next. So you have to commit to your change unless you're going to die as well. These losses, especially of co-desisting partners, also became synonymous with losing futures, because these rosy ideas of desisting together and cleaning up your act together died with the dying partner. So there was both a feared future self in terms of, if I don't change lanes, I could be next, but also in terms of, I'm going to be alone now, no matter what. So these themes all underscored the very real relational and emotional labors and troubles of these journeys. So basically, death was very ingrained in these lives that these women were leading.
Yeah, speaking of rosy relationship,
Segue.
yeah, not so much perhaps in heteronormativity and desistance. We capture the relationships to potential partners that they, like you said, some of them tried to desist together with, but others attempted to go into a relationship as part of their desistance journeys. And another quote to just set the scene for this is Johanna's. And she said, "I'm not letting anyone into my house again. No one can move in with me. Never. That ship has sailed. Yeah, I've only had bad experiences," which paints the picture quite well. That was their shared experiences of relationships in the past criminalized lifestyle. And now in Desistance, they had to navigate the challenges of heteronormative femininity, and they did so by balancing between conformity and resistance. And this resistance could include their appearance, like creative, non-conforming expressions of femininity, like unconventional hairstyles and perhaps seemingly minor, but to them definitely impactful acts of resistance or showing or feeling independence, rather, or living through that. Some of them tried dating in Desistance as well, which more than anything revealed frustrations with traditional gender roles, as those men were often unhelpful. That's perhaps a bit of an understatement.
Putting it mildly.
Yeah, they were outright abusive at times. But the important framing here is, of course, the backdrop against which we present these findings, which is the traditional desistance literature relying quite heavily on social control theory and the notion that relationships are good because they help men behave according to normative society's expectations. But that's not how it worked for these women, which is interesting, of course, and important to highlight. However, also failed relationships were sometimes framed as personal growth, helping the women to develop independence and redefine their sense of self. So not all was lost with these relationships. And as a final interesting point regarding these relationships was that child freedom, which is the voluntary decision to not procreate, emerged as a path to increased autonomy, and allowing them, some women at least in the study, to avoid the control and challenges associated with motherhood and co-parenting, which is otherwise quite pronounced in feminist criminological literature. So that was definitely interesting.
Yeah, and not in the least because they would have had to then co-parent with their abusers in most of these cases. Yeah. So getting away from that by just not putting themselves in that position, it's interesting. So clearly their dating lives were not, they were looking pretty bleak, but their social lives in general also looked quite unalive. So we also kind of came onto these ideas of death as perhaps not only a literal persistent presence in these women's lives, but also kind of a more metaphorical presence where many of these women spoke of various ways in which they're stripped of their whole lives for some fucking reason. So they're restricted from moving through the world in ways that they're familiar with or ways that they would like to, often by like projects and instances and institutions that's supposed to be helpful. So the dynamics of social life and social death kind of shed light on how these women navigate the space between leaving old connections and old things behind and striving to form new social connections, which often turned out to be a bit of an uphill battle. And the concept of social death captured both these instances of being in the space between, where you can't hang out with your old friends because they're bad for you now, but you also can't find new friends outside of very restricting, like state mandated or like state what is
Facilitated.
State facilitated, thank you. State facilitated types of social settings where you're like put in the same boat as other people in your social position. Like you make new friends, but with the same social group that doesn't really move you anywhere. So it also captures the sense of isolation that comes with, if this is all that's on offer, then maybe I would prefer trying on my own, but then failing, so you end up lonely and being distant from your old life while also struggling to find these new types of acceptance. So this social death idea kind of pushes the responsibility more towards the surrounding society to be more susceptible to what the needs actually are in terms of restructuring a new social life from a very marginalized position. And this also led to a distinguishing between voluntary solitude, which was pretty peaceful and could provide a sense of respite from a very stressful surrounding on the one hand, and then these types of more enforced loneliness and isolation on the other hand. And these more lonely experiences were both tied to boredom and like the realization that things in this new quote unquote new normal life are pretty dull because nothing's really happening, because these new things have yet to occur. You don't have the new job yet. You don't have these things that you were told to just go get as though it were easy. And that in turn can also cause various relapses and hinder a sense of reinvention. So the structural barriers to new social life include, on top of all of that, it includes specific things like protected identities stemming from having lived with abusive partners, and how that in turn limits their movement possibilities. Like how much can you can't sign up for gym memberships because you don't exist on paper. You can't get a library card because you don't exist on paper. It's kind of hard to join a social club if you're supposed to stay off the radar. You can't socialize on Facebook to meet new people, and so on and so forth. And various types of social support that groups you together with the people you're trying to leave in one way or another. So all of this kind of hindered the sense of progress they were striving for.
Right, and the final empirical chapter, paying for the past, about, of course, the baggage that they carry into this approaching normalcy and how to deal with all of that, which is not easy to say the least. Maya said, I mean, what's going on? Every month, this anxiety. Will I make ends meet? Can I pay my bills? Because there's never any money left. And that's, of course, a usual finding in desistance literature. Joanna Chapland talk about taking a pay cut, significant pay cut as you desist from crime. But the cumulative disadvantage that they experience obstruct their resistance journeys by restricting access to essential and interlocking resources like money, but also education, health, unemployment, etc. Importantly as well, they had to unlearn or relearn things as they approach normalcy, like personal finance management used to be something more of a lot of money, perhaps cash flow in, and equally as fast out again. You fast transactions in the drug business, for example. Now in normative economies, you have to wait for your salary, and you have to make sure that that salary covers the whole month. In Sweden, you get paid once a month. So that was new, and navigating bureaucratic obstacles that often hinder progress, tied to everything from roof over your head and housing to obtaining work or anything, basically have to navigate these vast bureaucratic apparatus.
Yeah, not to mention like the infinite loopholes of any type of subsidy, having to jump through lots of bureaucratic hoops that don't feel entirely reasonable.
Yeah. And of course, an enduring impact of the past shapes their current circumstances, like I started saying, and limits their possible futures. So you always carry your history with you. And in these cases, it was quite apparent how that was a hindrance. So talk about that.
Yeah, because in this theme, it became very apparent how the past really sticks to you in the shape of paperwork.
Yeah.
It's like you cannot have that undone no matter what you do as a person, because your paperwork is still very much present. And the Swedish state loves its paperwork, so there's a lot of it.
For sure. Okay, trying to round up this presentation, and it's hard work to
Summarize the book.
Summarize a book in a couple of minutes. But yes, conceptually then, or theoretically, we try to shift focus. We partially, of course, also want to carry the, I don't want to say tradition, but the
Carry the torch.
yeah, of feminist criminology of decentering masculinity as a default in desistance theory. But we also, as we did that, wanted to decentralize normalcy as a default position or a given good to strive for, given or unspoken or
Like taken for
challenged,
granted.
taken for granted good to strive for in theoretical development, which is our focus. But of course, this carries on to practice as well. And like I said, we can't go into every bit here, but we listed 3 examples that we have touched upon here, I think.
Yeah, but I think the one we kind of maybe haven't mentioned would be the idea of meaningful occupations aren't necessarily the same as getting a regular job, doing meaningful things with your time that feel like a contribution versus getting the job the state thinks you are qualified to do. These became very different.
And carrying over from the last topic of paying for the past, most people in prison have vast debts that they just cannot ever get rid of through labor, because you wouldn't even get to keep your salary. It would be deducted, and you got to keep the existential minimum, which is the same as if you were on benefits. So you don't gain anything from working, basically, in terms of money.
So clearly some implications for practice and like how to incentivize what types of things and why. But also in terms of these shifting focus types of thoughts, we were also throughout the book kind of preoccupied with exploring both these lingering pasts and the lost futures and how they impact the present and trajectories in various ways through this then ontological lens, which basically kind of centers ways in which things are both no longer and not yet present, but generally often at the same time, and how that can lead to like various unsettling and weird near encounters. And this is a very good fit for desistance. I mean, criminology has had a bit of a ontological reckoning these past few years, but not really with desistance in mind, even though it fits really well, because so much in desistance has to do with timing and life scripts and future trajectories and how do we move away from the past, can we, should we, all of these questions. But in terms of merging that with decentering normalcy as some sort of taken for granted given good, that also resonates with ontology's kind of penchant for shedding light on things that have otherwise been disappeared into a framework so that we don't talk about it anymore because it's just part of the status quo, part of what we need to take for granted in order to make other things make sense. So society's demands, which is what forms these notions of normalcy to a large extent, are kind of haunted by these ingrained and disappeared and taken for granted notions of who we should be and how we should behave. And that also carries over into, in terms of practice, perhaps even more, what the past can, should, and might mean for desisters in terms of their present and in terms of their future. Like if you don't break up with your past and consider it something terrible that you really don't abide anymore, then you're kind of failing desistance. So that carries a lot of weight. And this also raises questions of how both like criminological theory, but also like criminal justice practice are complicit in various social harms, which again is very much the ontological bread and butter, trying to find out how we cause the harms we think we're critiquing, and these kinds of dragging uncomfortable things out into the light, basically. So that's what we've been trying to like merge into the desistance literature. And with that, we spent 28 minutes. We even made it in time.
Wonderful. I mean, fantastic content, but even more important, impeccable timekeeping.
Right.
So
That's what
with
really
that,
matters.
I'll pass directly on to Marguerite, who I think is going to respond first of all.
Yeah.
Thanks, Fergus. Yeah, I know to both of you, I really enjoyed reading the book, and also to start with Style over Substance. I especially enjoyed some of the language, and I was really writing together. And one of you uses the word contrariwise. I think it's one of you. And I really I was like, oh, I've never seen that before, but it is a word and it means exactly what you think it means. So it's perfect. And I was like, oh, that's an interesting trace of who is writing at what point, maybe. And I also really, really liked you writing the a Q without the last UE. I thought that was another innovation and improvement on the English language. But leaving that aside, yeah, no, I thought that your unpacking of what is normal and what is this normality or normalcy that people aspire to was very important. So going beyond kind of the idea of it's just a house, a relationship, a job, maybe children, but like really kind of thinking, well, what kind of shadow sides are there with that? And also kind of the traces of the not normal, kind of the indelible marks almost in time or whatever that these women carry into their future, and that they can never kind of catch up with that normative life script, and how sometimes maybe making decisions like child freedom that mean that you're not aspiring to part of that create its own freedom. But also that normalcy itself is a little bit creepy, like that it kind of, you move from one type of life to another, and then suddenly you have to deal with the demands on women's bodies that you maybe haven't reckoned with before. And I thought that was a really illuminating kind of example of that and it's all around us. But what is normalcy? Like, it's not something, and can you only get to know parts of it when you move closer to that? But on the other hand, I was wondering, like, but who gets to define what normalcy is, right? Both in society, but also in this book, because I think sometimes it's interesting. I was wondering whether the women, and I was interested if the women have read the book, or some of them, like, would they agree or recognize what you mean when you say, for example, sometimes they're closer to normalcy than they realize? Right, there's a few places where you highlight that, and that I think that might include the body kind of shame that people feel. But, and is that then two different types of normal, kind of the normal that people want to move to, and the other bits that come with that I maybe hadn't anticipated, or maybe they won't see as normal, because how normal, I mean, it's something that a lot of women experience.
Yeah.
But is that then therefore normal, and who defines that? And interestingly, Robin, like, as a man, like, how, like, how do you define that, and then how does that capture their realities? And one thing that I also found really, really kind of notable is the total uselessness of men in this book, right? Like, they provide trauma, and they provide bereavement sometimes. I think there was one example of a partner who was also trying to desist, and they were doing it together, and that sounded like a pretty positive relationship. But other than that, there's one dad, right, who helps with the budgeting of somebody who's needing to get used to having a lot of money in one go and then having to space that out. But other than that, like, and is that normal, or is that like, do you think that's like a artifact of the people that you happen to speak to? And the other thing, the one thing that I did notice is kind of the way that the counterpole of normalcy, which is here the previous women's life, so the deviance that they were part of, there's times at which that almost seems quite attractive, and especially when you talk about social death, right? So that there was social life in deviance, but also that it was active and entrepreneurial. full sociability, but also money. And that's not something that I recognize from research in Scotland, where the reality of deviance, maybe at the start when people are teenagers, is maybe a bit more like that. But then people age out of their cohort and they're the only ones who are still going to prison. And then if there's drug addiction and things like that, it becomes actually really heavy and lonely in its own way as well. And then following up on that, because I'm reading this from the Scottish context, and I have read other works, obviously comparing Sweden and the UK. But in some ways, these women, from a Scottish perspective, seem really successful. At the same time, like there's several descriptions of people having jobs, of enjoying those jobs, of actually having that kind of occupation that is meaningful to them rather than just, and nobody died. So out of the 13 people I interviewed, 3 people have died. And so that in itself seems almost there's something protective going on there. And one question I had about that, like, how does that, is that kind of, do you feel like the experiences of these women are quite general, like that is what you would have found generally? Or because I noticed that they're all white, so would that be different for women from a different kind of ethnic background in Sweden? Or can you say anything about that?
Thank you. Excellent.
Let
Great
me
questions.
maybe add my response briefly, because I think there's overlap, so it'll be quicker if you just respond to it as a pair. Since you're a pair, we'll be a pair for the purposes of the seminar. And then we'll open the floor as quickly as we can. So I just wanted to add on the question of normalcy. When you first introduced the concept, I was thinking, are contemporary normative life scripts as linear, orderly, and uniform as your initial discussion suggests, or have they themselves become much more complex and contested? And I was thinking about this in relation to gender specifically, thinking even within the confines of middle-class norms in my small country, Scotland, I see much more diversity of life scripts and pathways. So while nobody's going to argue that patriarchy has been dismantled, gender positions, gender identities, gender expectations, and gender dynamics have all changed a lot in the last 50 years or so, which made me think, for these women in Sweden, is there more space or less space for desistance than there would have been? I know you can't answer that question empirically because you didn't do your work 50 years ago, but it's just a question that arose for me. And then as I was kind of ruminating further on that and on other aspects of the book, I was thinking maybe what you're illustrating is a tension between cultural accounts of normalcy, as a cultural concept anyway, and structural understandings of social integration or inclusion. Maybe a wider variety of forms of normalcy are available, but only to people who are structurally included. If you think in terms of social class or material resources, and so on. So that took me into a kind of ontological rumination on desistance, as you've provoked in the book, which is some of my favorite stuff. I guess some of the stuff which is newer to me because I've obviously been reading Robin's work for a long time. You made me think, are we haunted by an obsolete and a false vision of what integration looked like or looks like? Maybe integration, like normalcy, is a spectral idea, impossible to pin down or to see clearly, far less achieve. In fact, maybe integration, desistance, normalcy are all things that are more clearly seen in and through their absence. So, when desistance is seen only as the absence of offending, or integration is assumed to be where you are if you're not excluded, and so on and so forth. And then finally, or almost finally, the temporal dynamics of the ontological stuff are great, and reminded me actually of the piece that you cite a few times that Marguerite and I wrote together on tertiary desistance. And within that, there's some discussion of enduring temporariness, which is something that came out of the Distant Voices project for me, but I think it's also in Marguerite's Life Sentence project, that the liminality of desistance is structurally extended for some, and then contracted for others, depending on their social positions and identities. And I think that's, I think the work that you've done together really highlights those differences, particularly as they coalesce around gender, but the implications of the insight there about the structural construction of liminality and its difference, the different dynamic there for different people in different social situations is powerful. I was going to say something briefly about rehabilitation, but I'll save that for another day, and then just end on a kind of methodological, ethical question. I was really intrigued by the writing of the book. The fact that you come together to write this, one of you having done the empirical work, and you talked about this a little, and the other coming with fresh ideas, fresh perspectives, fresh insights. You reminded me of that Zygmunt Bauman quote about familiarizing the strange, or no, defamiliarizing the familiar and familiarizing the strange, or something like that. And in a way, you've modeled that by kind of forming a team to kind of look at the data afresh. But I wondered, is there an ethical question there as well? Like, if you add a second analyst, for want of a better expression, who doesn't have the relationship with the women, and then rewrite the meaning of the stories, what are the ethical issues that arise from that? And maybe the obvious question: did you go back to the women with the kind of new analysis? And if so, what did they make of it? I think Marguerite's already asked that in a different way. So I'll shut up there. You can respond to us as pithily as you like, keeping it brief, I think, to let others in. So yeah, fire away.
Excellent. All right.
You
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Sure. Yeah. Let's start at the top, I guess, with Marguerite's first question, because I think that's very interesting. Like, who defines normalcy and who doesn't define it? And I think that's perhaps the key here. The women felt, I think, quite vividly that they were not part of the normalcy, so they were not positioned to define it. But we think they do because they view it from the outside, and that's, like we have said, that's when it's visible what it is and what it isn't. So I think they were acutely aware of how they weren't part of normalcy, and the times that they encounter normalcy and recognize it as something familiar is often the bad parts, like Margaret said, with like men, particularly encountering men. And I guess that ties into another question on those useless men. I think it's definitely, it is, of course, it's gendered, but it's also classed, and other research in Desistance have shown that relationships in or feminist criminology broadly, relationships in these criminalized lifestyles tend to be very traditionalist in values, and that's also something that the women wanted to get away from, but didn't know how to in a way. So.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the most striking aspects of them being closer to normalcy than they otherwise think that they are, like when they articulate it, I think it's Maya going through her history with sexual abuse and landing in this sort of statement that while various like instances that are supposed to be helping her insist that these were cases of rape, her opinion is that sure, this was exploitative and it didn't feel too great, but don't normal relationships also occasionally look like this? Don't you have sex you aren't entirely on board with having just to keep the peace at home? That's what normal people do too. So when she aligns herself with I'm pretty normal in this regard, it's in a very bleak regard. So when they articulate normalcy, it's never, oh, I've finally arrived at this really fun thing that I associate with being normal. It's like, okay, this didn't deliver either. It's more of the same.
Yeah.
Because the other side of how they view normalcy through its absence kind of has a lot to do with these things that never occur. You think you're moving towards something that's supposed to be a calmer, nicer existence. And sure, it's calmer and nicer in some instances than being like actively involved in dangerous things. But it also isn't this goal that they envisioned arriving at. There's a lot of disappointment with, okay, I'm here, but it didn't really improve much. It just removed the bad things. It didn't add the new nice things. So you're still stuck in between positions. So normalcy is kind of this goalpost that keeps moving away and away and away. But then how much of that is normalcy and how much of that is just a very specific daydream that you didn't get to act on, like the food truck and like these kinds of things. So the question of what exactly is normal in all of this, I think it's interesting precisely because it is ephemeral and kind of tricky to nail down and changing with the times. And make sure this empirical data isn't from 50 years ago, but some of the women were in their 50s. So they are from 50s. So there is something to be said for their like what is aging as a woman generally, but then also aging as a woman in this specific context and the relation to class in terms of normativity. So there's a lot of interlocking weirdness going on with that.
Yeah. So should we let the rest of the room enter the chat?
Or should we just ramble?
Yeah, we could.
I think it's time to open up the floor, and I see we have a question from Abdullah, so fire away.
Yes, hello everybody. It's a very interesting topic actually. My name is Shahid and I work with one of the organizations in UK, Sheffield. And the ladies I work with, they have been some of them been subject to living the prison life. And the idea of normality, I found it defined by the men, especially when they are Arab or Pakistani Asian ladies. So the concept of normality, she doesn't think about it because men already defined that concept to her. And the decision of social death is already made by the society and community before even she think about it. So that really creates a severe mental health with the ladies when they leave the prison. And I found it very challenging to even give her the chance to resist, create resilience, because she already accepted the fact that she is categorized already by the men community who are, and the woman community who have the masculinity mind as well, who reject them and give them name. And my question to you guys, don't you think that you will really ignore the very important aspect, which is the cultural religious dimension of this woman's life? And I believe you have used autoethnography. I'm not sure, just guessing. You have used autoethnography for the interview. I'm not sure.
Okay, no,
Did you use the
autoethnographic? But yes, I think definitely you are onto something about, and Marguerite touched upon that as well, that all of the women are white and either Swedish or other Scandinavian ethnicity. And of course that means something, especially centering their role in normalcy in the Swedish society today. So definitely, but since they are white and either Swedish or other Scandinavian ethnicity, they don't really reflect on that position too much or at all, because it's normal to them. So empirically, it's very tricky to get at that when the sample is so normative.
Yeah, so I guess that is one of the instances where normalcy becomes very like invisibilized because they are for once in line with the expected normal social position. But as for religion, I feel like that's not really, both in terms of like what is the Swedish context is a very non-religious context, and for the women none of their stories goes very
I did ask about that. I had religion as an interview topic because the literature primarily from the US have stressed the importance of religion or religious awakening for people to exit prison, for example. But it was invariably just a
shrug.
Shrug, a non-topic for them to talk about because they weren't religious.
So I guess that whole question kind of centers the very context-based question of what is normal, because for this specific context, normalcy is very far removed from religious value, but in others it definitely wouldn't be. So it captures an interesting dynamic between where you look and what you find.
Maybe worth giving a plug to another book in the same series. So this book is in the Routledge series on desistance and rehabilitation, I think it's called. And there was one of the earliest volumes in that series is Adam Calverley's book on cultures of desistance, which does look at the experience of Bangladeshi Muslim, Indian, Sikh and Hindu, and Black and dual heritage men within one London borough. And it's a very interesting book in which religious ideas and participation in faith communities, the role that they play in desistance for some of those men, or the different roles that they play for different men, is a better way to put it, is well articulated in Adam's work. But yeah, good question. Any more questions? Danielle.
Good. Hello, hi everybody. Thank you for your actually your talk and your presentation, your book. That was fantastic, and make a question: what's normalcy? What normality is basically. So I'm kind of curious. I'm French. I'm a policymaker. I'm working at the French MOJ. So in light of your analysis, in light of your studies, I would like to know actually how can criminal justice basically policies and community support frameworks can be reimagined basically to facilitate a truly transformative desistance process, one that take account the gender challenges that you basically kind of mentioned basically. Just have your thought and reflection on that.
Yeah.
An easy, small
no, but it's an excellent question.
It's a really good question.
A big one, but it's an excellent one. I think just from the top of my head, I think what I've found working with this material for so long is that a lot of the frustration that they encounter when encountering the system and its various social support units, which are vast, and it's every aspect of their lives are tied to some level of support system. But when it works, it tends to be, this is of course simplified, but when they have some matter of say in their in the support that they can get. Primarily, I think this is a fault with the prison probation services, because they are very square and non-flexible. So they have a program which everybody should pass through, regardless of if they believe in it or if they want to do it or whatever. And that doesn't tend to work for people who don't want to undertake that program. Again, as Joanna Shapland has written, when we ask desisters what they want for their future, they tend to have this really conformative and modest ideas or dreams about their future. And if that could be channeled better by support organizations, they could work together towards a shared goal, I think, instead of shoving. They could lead.
Yeah. And I mean, I think from a lot of what we've seen in here as well, very much I think could be gained from simplifying processes, because so much of what these women have struggled with had to do with supposed help coming in the shape of having to check a lot of boxes, not all of them relevant. If you check the wrong one, it's going to take a half a year to get that corrected. It's like there's a lot of bureaucracy that's really not what you need when you're already struggling. I mean, that could be annoying enough for anyone, but especially if you're already like dealing with various types of trauma, or like the order in which things are enforced to be dealt with. Like if you don't deal with your drug problems, we won't help you with your trauma treatment because this has to happen first. Maybe that's not helpful for this specific person. So I think simplification would go a long way, as long as that simplification is like attuned to what people actually say that they need. It's like maybe take their word for them, knowing what they actually need, because see, it sounds like it should be simple and easy to do, but it's definitely what they don't get.
It's a tangible
Right.
in the narratives.
I think we've got time for one more question. Just before we come to Jelly to ask that question, that last answer reminded me of John Halushka's book. I don't know if you read it, called The Runaround, which is about re-entry in New York and precisely those kind of forms of bureaucratic violence, really, that kind of make unreasonable, excessive, and unhelpful demands on people coming out of prison in terms of their re-entry processes. It's a very well written and vivid articulation of just how crazy that system can be. And I'm not criticizing New York. I think it's the case in many different places. Jelly, over to you.
Thanks, Fergus. Thanks, Teo and Robin, for a fascinating, as always, presentation. It was amazing. This is not really a question, it's more of an observation and a kind of reflection, really. So there's such a small amount of research on desistance and women that gender nearly is always the variable which we can consider. And I think, you know, my work's often looked at youth and gender. Your work, whilst not specifically, could be said to look at kind of middle age and gender to some extent. And it made me think, I think Marguerite mentioned this, the age stage of the women is probably really quite significant in terms of how much has gone behind and how much is to live forward. And the kind of accumulation of losses and accumulation of trauma, and also perhaps cultural expectations of middle-aged women being invisible and not being so important, in contrast to younger women being hyper-visible when they misbehave, is probably really significant. So I think this focus on kind of middle age and gender is probably quite an important thing to pick up on in future research. So yeah, I guess when I think about young women, I often think about injustice and anger and spiritedness, whereas a lot of what you're saying makes me think of quite miserable stuff to do with loss, trauma, dashed hopes. So yeah, there's perhaps more looking back than looking forward, which I think is quite significant in relation to how we think about time.
And since you mentioned time,
But Fergus, there's
jump in,
also
Marguerite.
there's just maybe we can end by going back to the beginning, because there's one question on the chat as well, just about how you recruited the women, Robin. And if you have time, if you could just explain that to us,
Sure.
that'd be really
happy to. Definitely. So it is a deliberately broad approach to recruiting these, because I wanted to capture them as they were in the very early stages of desistance. That was the only criteria I set up as I wanted to recruit women who had taken some kind of initial step towards desistance. The decision was made, but perhaps not much more than that. And of course, where do you find how many are currently undertaking desistance in Sweden, and where are they? How do I find them? So I had to recruit broadly. I did that through some prison facilities. Inside in prison, it had the added criteria that they couldn't have too much left of their sentence to serve, at maximum 6 months, because I had to be able to follow them out of there. But I did recruit one of them from prison. She had 12 days left to serve when we held our interview. I asked her, do you want me to do the interview in prison, or should we wait until you're outside? And she said, I don't know where I am when I exit these prison walls. I have nothing to come out to. So we did it in prison, and then I followed up. That was actually a quicker follow-up than 6 months from between the first and the second interview, because so much was uncertain in her life. But I also had advertisements in probation centers across various locations, and I had similar contacts and in-person meetings with non-governmental organizations that support re-entry. Those exist across the country in Sweden, both who help men and women together, but also who are focused on specifically on women. And that was the main ground for recruitment. That was the best way to find these women and engage them in the study. And then lastly, some of it was a traditional snowball sample as well. Some women could tip me off on other in similar situation that I could approach.
Okay, thanks, Robin, and thanks everybody for coming. I'll just end with another vote for Jilly's suggestion. I think the examination of the kind of life stage, midlife, interrelation with desistance and gender is interesting. And actually, Beth Weaver's book was also largely based on research with men, in that case in midlife. So maybe there's a little comparison to be made there. So well, we can end there, but thanks everybody for coming and for such a fascinating discussion. Thanks especially to Thea and Robin for sharing their book with us. You can find it in all the usual places. It's a Routledge book, Desistance, Resistance and Normalcy. And I'm sure if you want to get in touch directly with Thea and Robin at Stockholm University, they'll be able to direct you to other stuff which is probably not paywalled that could be shared with you from the project. So don't hesitate to do that. Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Sorry guys, I have to jump off straight away to get into another meeting, so I'm gonna love you and leave you, but that was wonderful. Really enjoyed it.
That's great.
And I hope we had more time to speak soon. So many interesting thoughts.
Also look at the comments, because there's a lot of positive comments. Right?
There are.
It's always nice to copy and paste before you
Save the chat. All right, take care.
Thank you.